In an earlier video, we talked about three behavioral patterns that emerge from a time series data set. We will now deep dive into each of the three patterns and talk about their respective techniques to make a forecast. A trend pattern can be seen from a long-term upward or downward movement in the data. The first thing you should do when you receive a data set is to plot it in order to see if any patterns emerge from it. Using this problem as an example, let's see if any patterns emerge when you plot it in Excel. So in the X, we have our months, and the Y's, we have our unit sales. And when looking at the platter chart, you can see that the data appears to have a trend going upwards. Whenever we see a pattern like this, we know that we will be using the trend technique to do our analysis. Well, for the purpose of this course, we'll be solely focused on linear trends because they are the most common. You should be able to visually recognize other trends as well, such as the parabolic trend, the life cycle trend, the exponential trend, and the growth curve. Again, for the purpose of this course, we'll be exclusively focused on learning the linear trend technique. Now let's take a closer look at the linear trend equation, which we'll be using to make our forecast when we see the trend pattern emerge. The FT represents the forecast for period T and is represented by this line. A is the value of FT at t equals 0, which is another way of saying it's the y-intercept and is located right here. B is the slope of the line, which we should know is the change in y over the change in t. T represents the number of time periods from t equals 0. Let's take a look at this in action. A typical linear trend equation question you might get is as follows. Using the following trend equation, make a forecast for time period equals 10. Before we solve for time period 10, let's take a quick look at this equation in graphical form. We know that the x-axis represents t, or time, and the y-axis represents y. We also know that this is a linear trend forecast, so let's draw a trend line. This trend line, we know, is represented by the trend formula. We also know that A is the y-intercept, and in this case, A equals 45. This means that when t equals 0, y equals 45. From this formula, we also know that B, or the slope, is 5. This means that for every one period of t, y increases by 5. So now that we better understand the components, let's solve for ft. Again, we are solving for time period 10, so we would write f 10 equals 45 plus 5t. We know that t equals 10, which means the forecast for time period 10 is 95 units. To see this on the graph, we know that t equals 10. We know that 95 falls onto the trend line, and we know that this value is 95. In the previous example, the question gave us A, it also gave us B, and then you were asked to forecast for a specific time that was given to you as well. Another type of question that will be given to you is that you will have to determine the linear trend equation from a given table. Using the data in the table, you will determine B and A. Once A and B are determined, you will be able to forecast for any time period t by plugging t into the formula. Now let's look at how to determine A and B. Here are the two formulas to determine the slope and the y-intercept. Lucky for you, on any in-class exam, A and B will be provided for you. However, you will need to know how to derive the slope and y-intercept through using the regression analysis in Excel. Now let's look at a sample question to demo how to use Excel to discover the slope and y-intercept of a linear trend equation. Once again, let's look at our national scan example to demo using Excel to solve a linear trend problem. The question states, forecast September sales using a linear trend equation. When given a question like this, the first thing I would do would be to write out the appropriate equation. Once you have identified the right equation to guide you, you will notice that the first thing you need to do is to determine A and B, which, like I said earlier, we'll be using Excel. And then we can forecast for September by plugging in T. Let's look at this in action. Here, I have already entered the data that was given to us in the question. However, the first thing I would do would be to add an additional column called T, which will list the time periods. And we are solving for period 8, which is September. In order to solve for this, we'll be using an Excel tool pack called Data Analysis. Simply go to Tools, Data Analysis, and select Regression. Remember from the table earlier, the x-axis represents T, and the y-axis in this case represents units sold. When selecting the data, if you include the label row, which is right here, make sure you check the label box. All right, let's do this. The Y range, sales. The X range is the time period. And then we want to output, we'll say right here is fine. And then hit OK. So let's take a closer look at the summary outputs. So the linear trend equation is Ft equals A plus B times T. I'm going to sound repetitive here, but A, which is the intercept, is found right here, and B, which is the slope, is found here. Now that we have the values of A and B, we can plug them into the linear trend equation. With the completed equation, we can now forecast for any month. In this case, the question is asking us to forecast for September, which is period 8. All we need to do is plug it into the equation we discovered. And this equals 20.86 units. And as a final remark, now that we are armed with a linear trend equation, we can forecast for any month we choose.